out once it's available. We are excited here today to have both the Renew America Schools program and the Loan Programs Office, both two different teams within the U.S. Department of Energy, do a co-webinar, really to highlight the opportunity to utilize LPO program funds. So Mariah, if you flip to the next slide, I'm going to take us through some introductions and some intro slides on the Renew America Schools program, and then I will pass it over to some colleagues from the Loan Program Office. So if we go to the next slide. So just high level for you all, there are two different teams here within the Department of Energy. I am under the State and Community Energy Program, which houses the Renew America Schools program. This program funds grant opportunities for energy efficiency and renewable upgrades at K-12 public schools. And the other colleagues with me on the call today, Hans and Elizabeth, are with the Loan Programs Office. We will probably call that LPO for short. So my apologies for the acronyms. We'll do our best today to not use too many acronyms within DOE. But this is a finance, innovation, clean energy, and advanced transportation and tribal energy projects. So we're excited for them to share a little bit more. There's lots of nuances to it. So hopefully this is just a starting point for you all and we can continue to engage with folks. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm Andrea Swayatoka. Again, I'm on the State and Community Energy Programs, which we refer to as SCEP. And specifically within that, I'm on the Schools and Nonprofits team that runs the Renew America Schools program. I will let Hans and Elizabeth introduce themselves.
Everybody, I'm Hans Reamer, and I'm a contractor with the Loan Programs Office based out of Washington, D.C. area, and I lead our state and local engagement team. And I work with states across the country. There's several of us in the team. We're working with states to help understand how to unlock LPO's financing and how to bring it to bear to support state goals for clean energy. So really grateful for this opportunity. We think we've got some exciting possibilities we're eager to share. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Hans, I'm Elizabeth Bellis-Wolf, also a contractor with the Outreach and Business Development team at the Loan Programs Office at DOE. I coordinate our state-supported transaction work. So when Hans's efforts with states have borne fruit and there's an application ready to come into our office, I help shepherd that and guide our applicants and my colleagues in bringing that to fruition. So I'm excited to talk to you all today about the program and some of the relevant terms. Thanks.
Thank you both. So we wanted to start out with talking about the challenges at K-12 schools. And so while at the Renew America Schools program, that's largely a grant program, we are trying to provide technical assistance and opportunities to access other financing. Hence why we are doing this webinar. We think there's a really great opportunity here for collaboration with LPO. So hopefully a lot of this doesn't come as a surprise to you all, but with over 100,000 public schools across the country, we continue to be in a major need for both maintenance and capital funding. And some of these, statistics are a few years old, and so this number just continues to grow. And with some of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I'll explain what that is on the upcoming slide, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, there are some really great opportunities that we think can help solve some of these maintenance and capital fundings, while also helping you hopefully reduce your overall operational costs, making things more energy efficient. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to just highlight some of the statistics that are known out there in terms of energy usage at schools. So primarily based on the GAO report, it has been found that really HVAC is needed in almost a third of the public schools across the country. And when we look at the education sector, space heating accounts for the largest share of the end use consumption at 42%, followed by cooling, lighting, and et cetera. So you can see some of those statistics there, which again, probably doesn't come at a surprise to you all. So we're really looking at creative ways, both for you all to consider maintenance and capital needs, while also reducing those overall energy expenditures that you have right now, hopefully putting additional money back into your operating costs. If we go to the next slide. Wanted to just give an overview. We will talk, or you might hear bill reference, and so wanted to just explain quickly what that is if you are not familiar. So back in November of 2021, Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law. We typically refer to it as bill. That provided DOE $62 billion across many different programs within the agency, one of which is the Renew America Schools program. But you can see here, it really covers a wide expanse from upgrading grid infrastructure to some of our smaller programs in different teams. If we go to the next slide, about 9 months later, another major legislation passed in August of 2022, and President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which we often refer to as IRA. And this also is a very historic moment, really across both of these in combination. One of the things that's interesting about this is the tax credits that now became available to tax-exempt entities, such as public schools. We do plan to host a separate webinar specific to tax credits, often referred to as elected pay or direct pay. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you've signed up on the Renew America Schools program listserv so that you will be notified when that webinar comes up later in the spring. But that really, I think, can play into how you think about the potential opportunity to use some of this loan program funding that's, again, it's a loan that's available as you think about ways to leverage the tax credits that are available through IRA. We go to the next slide. So when you think about bill and IRA, again, these two massive legislations, kind of three different buckets that we think about them in. It could be in a competitive grant format, again, such as the Renew America Schools grant program, or many of you are probably familiar with the EPA Clean School Bus program. Those are all very highly competitive and a very strategic and streamlined application process. Then there are things like what I just mentioned with the IRS and Treasury for tax credits, either that elective pay, so they're not competitive, but you have to submit, really when you're completed with the project and there's a certain time. What we're going to talk about today is different than those two, which you probably are a little bit more familiar about. We're going to talk about the third bucket, which is loans. And that's what my colleagues, Hans and Elizabeth, will talk about the DOE Loan Program Office and what their opportunity is to help you think through funding strategies as you think through the projects you need to implement. So if we go to the next slide. So we see a number of different values in terms of working with LPO, and we really see ourselves as a liaison to help bring, all of our key stakeholders in the Renew America Schools program, our school districts, and other key stakeholders that are hopefully on the call with us today or listening to the recording. We really want to bring you all to LPO to have these conversations and think about opportunities that might come about. The benefit of the loan program is it is not a competitive process, thus they can have more streamlined conversations with you all. That is different when it comes to our competitive grant, where things need to be done in a more public Q&A process. But we can have one-on-one conversations if there is an interest in pursuing any of the loan programs. So they have access to patent capital, flexible financing, and really just committed to DOE partnerships. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to pass it over to Hans and Elizabeth to take us through a series of slides that hopefully explains a little bit more about their program, what they can fund, and how this might work.
Great. I'll just want to thank Skip, and then I'll pass it to Elizabeth. We're really grateful for the leadership in the State and Community Energy Programs department and team. And you're out in the communities across the country. You're working with school districts in a once-in-a-generation opportunity here. And to bring this together with financing, I think has tremendous potential. So thank you, Andrea, and appreciate it. And over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Hans. Let's go right into our slide 2. All right. So as Andrea mentioned, the Loan Programs Office at the U.S. Department of Energy administers multiple loan authorities. You've heard of our tribal program, perhaps. And each of these has a different statutory framework, requirements, and considerations. We're very well known for early support of innovative projects in electric vehicle manufacturing and utility scale solar, as just a couple of examples. Today, though, we're here to tell you more about our loan program for projects supported by state energy financing institutions, or SEFIs, because this program may be the most relevant to many of the school projects that you are considering. Unlike many of the LPO projects you might be most familiar with, projects that come to us through this program do not need to demonstrate innovation. They may use fully commercialized energy technologies that have already been in continuous operation at scale in the US for more than 5 years. Instead of demonstrating innovation, these projects qualify for LPO support by demonstrating meaningful support from one or more state energy financing institutions. Let's move to slide 3. Thank you. So while innovation is not required, like all LPO projects, SEFI-supported projects do need to demonstrate a few key facts. First, they have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Second, there needs to be a reasonable prospect of repayment. This is a loan and not a grant. And third, they need to employ a technology from a list of eligible categories that include categories like efficient end-use technology, renewable generation, and storage, just to name a few. Next slide. There are at least 2 typical routes by which SEFI-supported projects seek LPO support. The first, and probably the most common, is where a private sector project developer applies to LPO for a project that anticipates receiving significant funding from a state agency. An example might be a private sector school bus operator or solar developer, or even an energy services company. In these instances, the state involvement and risk is quite limited. The burden is on the private sector applicant to provide information to LPO, pay for transaction expenses, and repay the loan. The State Energy Financing Institution, the SEFI, provides support, but doesn't have to source or provide the large amount of equity that's required for a project to be eligible for LPO support. Sometimes, however, projects are just too small for the developer to apply directly to LPO for support, even though they're receiving meaningful SEFI support. And we'll talk a little bit later about sort of project size guidelines. But in these instances, a SEFI might apply directly to the loan programs office to support a clearly delineated portfolio of underlying projects across a number of sites or schools that together constitute a unified project that LPO can support. To take this route, the SEFI will have to be comfortable with the idea of being a party to a contract with LPO, making representations and covenants about the project, accepting choice of law and venue provisions, and making a commitment to repay a loan that has been guaranteed by the federal government. With a SEFI borrower that is not for profit, which is typically the case for most public institutions, additional federal requirements regarding domestic content generally apply from the Build America, Buy American law. And we'll come back to federal requirements like BABA later in the presentation, but it is an important consideration in thinking through the approaches to LPO supporting a schools project. In addition, a SEFI will need significant funds to cover the portion of project costs that cannot be financed by LPO. So I'll turn it over now to my colleague Hans, who will walk you through some simple infographics to illustrate the difference in the capital stack between these 2 common approaches to SEFI-supported projects. Hans?
Great. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to show 2 slides that illustrate those 2 options that Elizabeth just walked through. So what we're trying to do here is give a representation of the LPO portion of the project, the LPO finance portion, as well as the equity or subordinated capital portion, and then the SEFI meaningful support. So this visualization is where a company, let's say it's an energy as a service company that is going to do improvements and an energy project across 100 schools. That company is the borrower from LPO, and that company is presumably bringing to the table the sponsor equity and the private equity mezzanine debt, although there could be different flavors of that. There could be philanthropic debt equity in there to improve the finances of the project for schools. But the thing we kind of want to call your attention to is there's a slice there, there's a layer there that is the SEFI investment. So we'll talk a little bit more about what SEFIs might be in these situations, but this is just a representation to show LPO will finance a portion of the project, the SEFI has to finance a portion of the project, and the applicant comes to the table with a significant amount of subordinated capital and equity. Next slide. So again, as mentioned, that aforementioned slide was really when a project is larger, because our loans, you really don't want to borrow less than $100 million from us due to the costs that we'll talk about it a little bit later. So how would you think about it if you had the possibility of doing $1 million projects, $2 million projects across a large portfolio of schools? Again, you could have a company that is the borrower from us, or you could have a special purpose vehicle that is organized by the state, by a partner to the state, and that vehicle could be the borrower. So in that case, you still have the same kind of limitation on how much of the project LPO is going to finance. And then you still have the requirement for a SEFI to make a meaningful investment in the project. And you still have the equity requirement. But you might think about how you source some of those a little bit differently when it is essentially a public sponsored project. So again, the purpose here is when you have lots of small projects that are alike, you can potentially organize a special purpose vehicle and come to us. Next slide.
Thanks, Hans. Let's now talk a little bit more in detail about the nature of the support that LPO can provide for a project. LPO can work together with an institution called the Federal Financing Bank at the U.S. Treasury to provide a guaranteed loan directly to your project. And just a note, we handle the Federal Financing Bank interface for you. You don't have to make any kind of separate application. It's all one process. Or if you have an eligible third-party lender that you'd like to work with, LPO might guarantee that lender's loan to the project. In either case, though, the LPO guaranteed loan must be senior. It cannot be subordinated to any other financing in the structure. And LPO also generally requires a senior security interest in the relevant project collateral, whether that is the hard assets or contractual revenues. The interest rate or guarantee fee for a SEFI-supported project can depend on a number of factors, including how long the loan is to be outstanding, the treasury rate on the date of each draw, how risky the project is, the extent to which the project aligns with policy objectives, and the availability of any appropriated funds that might be used to subsidize any expected losses. For any loan from the Federal Financing Bank, the starting building block for thinking about the ultimate cost to the borrower is whatever the applicable treasury rate is for the tenor or the term of the draw that's being requested. So for example, if you're asking for a 10-year loan, you would look at the 10-year treasury rate. Then there's a 3/8 percentage point liquidity charge, and then a risk-based charge is negotiated with the applicant and will be set at commitment based on the rating, the risk rating for the project. On the date of any given draw on an LPO guaranteed loan from the Federal Financing Bank, the interest rate for that draw is set based on the relevant treasury rate on that date plus the agreed spread. Applicants are responsible for paying due diligence costs, including those incurred by DOE for our advisors. And those can frequently run multiple millions of dollars in total. And they begin to be incurred and required to be paid before the applicant receives a commitment of LPO support. If a commitment is received, applicants are required to pay a commitment fee that begins at 0.6% of the total amount committed and a reduced percentage for very large loans. It's sort of a declining balance, declining scale. There are also annual maintenance fees of up to $500,000 annually for particularly complex or labor-intensive projects or loan agreements. These can be much lower for simpler projects and loan agreements. This slide covers some of the key legal limitations on the terms of an LPO-supported loan, but rather than reading you all of the information on this slide, a note to think about these figures as you're reading them. It's rare that actual LPO-supported loans have terms that go to our absolute maximum or minimum legally permissible amounts. What's realistic for a particular project will depend on the facts and the circumstances of that project, and may be more conservative than the legal limitations here. For example, while LPO can support up to 80% of the costs of your project, of the eligible costs of your project, it's frequent that it is actually representing only 50 to 70% of the capital stack on some projects that it supports. Similarly, while LPO can provide support for up to 30 years for projects that are financing very long-lived equipment, it's not uncommon for supported loan tenors to be shorter than that. So that was a lot, but Hans will review and dive in a little bit deeper on some of the topics we covered on this slide later in the presentation. I'll turn it back to him now to tell you more about considerations specific to school projects.
All right, I think we're about a mile deep already, and it's a lot of information here. So we know that this slide, the webinar will be available online, and there are a lot of resources on our website that provide the kinds of information about the terms, for example, as Elizabeth just walked through. And I'll just say, before we proceed further, like, when you're interested, we work with you. So don't feel like you have to fully process all of this now. Our goal is to hopefully get you interested. So I'm just going to walk through some of the considerations that come up as you're thinking about how LPO could be a resource. I mean, just very fundamentally, it's potentially an alternative source of debt for your projects. You could figure out a strategy to leverage the tax credits and LPO financing. It could be very, very, very interesting, the possibilities here. So we're not going to provide a kind of how-to necessarily, but we're going to just talk about some of the issues that you'll encounter. And frankly, we're looking for creative thinking out there to help figure out how to deploy this capital and to make the most of this opportunity. So it's a moment for people who can be creative about finance and apply finance to our goals. So we're here to be a resource for you as you proceed. So some of the issues that are relevant here. First, just to state the obvious, for the schools that might participate in the program, there can be a simple benefit of a reduction in their energy cost. That's the incentive for schools to sign up. You could certainly structure a program so that schools have a reduced energy cost. There can be additional benefits as well, but that's kind of a starting point here. Second, we talked a little bit about the framework of the loan sizes. Now, this applies really in both instances of how LPO financing could be utilized. But the core idea is organizing a pipeline of projects, and they're projects that are similar enough that they can ultimately be rated as a portfolio. We generally, as mentioned, we find that due to some of the costs of the application process and some of the requirements of the financing, that it really doesn't make much sense to seek less than a $100 million loan. And there is no upper limit here. So, I mean, there's always practical considerations, but there isn't a statutory limit to how large a loan could be. So, but we would certainly suggest that a $100 million loan size is the starting point. So with our limit on how much of a project we can finance, you're talking about a portfolio that might be 125 million, 130 million, 140 million. And the portfolio of projects, you wouldn't necessarily need to have 200 schools committed, but you have to have enough that we can really do adequate diligence on that. As Elizabeth mentioned, our financing, we have to find that there is a reasonable prospect of repayment, and that's based on an extensive diligence process. So you would come forward with a portfolio, whether it's the company that is the applicant or it's the special purpose vehicle that's the applicant. In either case, there's a sufficiency in the portfolio to proceed through the requirements of due diligence. You mentioned a little bit about the distinction or the kind of equity requirement. So LPO is looking for partners, we want to fund projects where there is sufficient first loss capital so that we're not the only ones, stepping up when there's a default. And so we look to the applicant to come to the table with equity, mezzanine debt, other forms of subordinated capital that is available in the event of default. Now, how do you meet that requirement? Again, this is where some creativity can come into play. There could be a role for philanthropic capital. Certainly school districts or states have appropriations for energy expenditures, for equipment upgrades. And the question will be, how can some of those funds essentially be available to meet the equity requirement? You could have private investment. There's lots and lots of different ways to think about it. Just please kind of see the framework here of subordinated capital. There's some sponsor equity required, and then additional subordinated capital required for protection against default. The tax credits are, of course, a major element, and the tax credits are probably the largest single source of financing for clean energy projects that are out there. So you can think through how could an individual school benefit from the clean energy tax credits, and then use our financing to kind of help smooth that path. So that certainly is a big opportunity here. Kind of mentioned already, core question, who's the borrower? And just think that through. There's multiple ways you could build a program, and we're here to give you some feedback on what those could be. But is it a state entity itself? Is it a special purpose vehicle? Is it alternatively a private sector entity that is already providing services to the schools? All of those are possibilities. Next slide, please. Okay, the question has been asked about meaningful support. What does that mean? And as Elizabeth described, we are allowed to waive the innovative technology requirement when there is a state energy financing institution that is making a meaningful investment in the project. We review the proposed investment by the SEFI, and we assess whether we indeed find that it is meaningful. There is a blog and a webinar on our website where we have more information about that. There's a lot of nuance in that discussion. So, we'll talk with you as you proceed. But a headline point here is there could be lots of different entities in the state that might be the SEFI. It could be a construction authority potentially. It could be the Energy Administration. It could be a green bank. It could even be an economic development authority. Perhaps there's a jobs-focused strategy in your portfolio that would be interesting to an economic development authority or commerce department. There's lots of possibilities here. So just kind of think through how would a project be financed and what state entity might be willing to support it. I think we have talked a little bit about the distinction between meaningful support and the equity requirements. So hopefully that was clear from at least the visualizations, if just not generally the discussion. But generally speaking, the equity requirement is much more than the SEFI investment requirement. The SEFI investment is essentially a de-risking investment. It's not the core equity requirement. So I think the visualization kind of expressed the relative shares there, but we're here to give you feedback on that. Okay, so a point here about we cannot guarantee tax exempt bonds. That's something we're not able to do. It's essentially restricted federal support. It's worth noting that other sources, that when you use tax exempt bonds, there are some implications for the tax credits, as I'm sure you are aware of, and you're working with your tax advisors on. So the question is, how do you balance the different sources of debt or financing to maximize the total resources that you have available? And certainly our theory here might be that LPO is a strong possibility for you to maximize the total resources that you have available. a overarching point, and then I'll pause and we have one more slide in the school considerations, but I want to make sure if anything for Elizabeth to jump in on. But regarding our finding of ability to repay, which is kind of, it's the core methodology, or it's what we do here. So when your project is less risky, then there's a stronger ability to repay. And when there's a stronger ability to repay, that is going to mean that it has lower cost capital potentially. It might have a simpler application process, which might cost you less money as an applicant. It could take a lot less time. So as you're thinking about various approaches, to the extent that you can find a way for the state or for a collection or a highly rated agency to guarantee repayment, that will be a significant advantage for your project. It isn't, we can also do project finance that doesn't have that benefit, but it's just that if you can gain access to that, it's going to cost you less and take you less time, which are things that are important. So Elizabeth, would you please join us here?
Sure. No, I agree with all of that. I think maybe I can tie together a few thoughts on some of the questions that are coming in a chat with what you said. Someone asked, is this one entity or multiple? And I think we usually have one entity that is the borrower, but they might be using back-to-back agreements with a number of underlying entities as a way to aggregate a project. So the answer is sort of, it could be either, depending on how large the project sizes are. Somebody also asked about underwriting to attendance-based revenues as opposed to energy savings. We have the general requirement that we find a prospect of repayment. We don't have a specific regulation on sort of which types of revenues we look to in making that determination. So we can see projects that have guarantees from the state, and we're looking just to the state's credit rating. And in that instance, frankly, we don't have to get into as much of the details, right, of the underlying school's revenue if we have a credit-worthy state. That's a very easy structure, moves quickly, probably has lower cost. We also see situations where that's not possible. The state isn't ready to stand behind all the school districts. Maybe there's a very wide variety of credit ratings of the various school districts, and the state is only willing to stand behind some of them. In those sorts of instances, that's when we're going to dig into the sources of revenue that the particular off-taker has essentially to look to support debt service payments on the loan. And that's where, if you've got a third-party developer that you're working with and you are just agreeing we're going to pay a certain portion of our energy savings, that's a way in which we might be looking to energy savings, but that's by no means the only way we would think about underwriting for these projects. It's one of our great blessings and arguably our curses that we are not very formulaic. We have a lot of flexibility. So it's harder for us to just show you a slide and say, this is how we do it. But the plus side of that is I think we're able to analyze a lot of these different kinds of structures that you're asking about and really encourage you to bring those to us so we can dive in with them, with you on them. Hans, I don't know if that's where you were going
perfect.
With that, but
Yep.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. So some additional commentary here. So draws from an LPO loan can be staged over several years. So you will request an amount, and then ultimately, as we'll get into, you'll pay a commitment fee for the amount that you want to borrow. But you don't have to draw it all at once. So you could draw it down over several years. I think Elizabeth already mentioned that the rate that you would pay would be based on the applicable Treasury rate for that tenor, 10-year Treasury, 10-year term. It's worth noting the potential here, because if you have a really effective project execution, then some of the tax credit resources could potentially be available for equity needs as you proceed through the project timeline. So, those are some of the factors to be aware of. Okay, next slide. All right, Elizabeth, maybe I'll pass it to you.
Sure. So this is a kind of a going further on that riff I had about different ways we underwrite and think about potential project structures. folks often assume that we can only finance against hard collateral, as in, a pledge, an equipment pledge of a lien against the solar or, the HVAC system or the buses or the EV chargers or whatever it is that's being financed. That is certainly something we're comfortable with. We like that kind of a structure, but we also understand that in the context of schools, you're often working with third-party providers, and what they may have is essentially a right to receive revenues from you with respect to what has been installed and the services that they're providing. And they can actually pledge the revenues on those contracts as their collateral to support their repayment of a loan if you choose to go with the structure where, rather than applying directly as a school or as a state, you have a private sector entity that's applying with respect to a number of projects that you might be providing more limited support to. We are still limited in what we finance. I think I did see a question about sort of the costs that we can support. We do have specific regulations listing out kind of a list of never allowed and generally allowed, and then kind of a catch-all for dealing with things that we might not have thought about. Some of the obvious never allowed costs are bribes, success fees, operating expenses, so ongoing staff after the project is sort of set up and commissioned, the ongoing O&M is not an allowable cost that you can draw for. But the upfront capital costs of most energy-related systems, right, is really kind of our orbit that we're looking at. We do see some applicants who are using vehicles as energy-related assets, so we can talk about that if your school district is doing that, even though that would traditionally be more on the transportation side of things. We're seeing more crossover in projects than we used to. And then sort of as Hans noted, there's revenue generation options with some of these projects, right, where you're allowing someone to optimize when you're charging or discharging your assets, and as a result they're paying you a share of the revenue that can be generated in some locations as a result of being able to provide that flexibility. We're seeing that can be very significant for assets that you have sort of set schedules that don't necessarily correspond to the peaks that are challenging to manage in your utility zone. It can be a real opportunity to offset costs. So that's something we can help you explore as well if you're talking to us about your project.
Great. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last couple slides are basically information that you'll find on our website. So I just wanted to kind of draw your attention to them so that you know how to find the additional resources that are available. So I did put a link in the chat earlier, and of course, Andrea is going to send out a follow-up communication to everyone who registered. But on our website, you'll find one of the pages, as you see here, which has our program guidance. So that's kind of an overall manual for working with LPO. It's very helpful. It's quite well written. And then you'll see application instructions. So we have, as we'll walk through a little bit, a multi-stage application process. So you can look here to see what do you submit for a Part 1 application, for a Part 2 application. So you got a better sense of what the requirements are to be an applicant. Next slide. All right. So we've talked a little bit about fees and costs, but this is definitely one of the hurdles for this project strategy, because the application costs that an applicant incurs have to be paid in real time. You have to pay them up front, essentially. The good news is some or a lot of those expenses you can reimburse yourself essentially from your loan proceeds at your first draw, so you don't necessarily have to, incur that expense forever. But you do have to have those funds up front. So what does that cost? Well, there are several different sources of cost. There's no fee, but there's several different sources of cost. One of them is that when an application gets really far into the process, we hire independent advisors to rate the project and do various aspects of the diligence. And that ensures that the project knows that there's an independent advisor and the taxpayer knows that there's an independent advisor. So those costs will typically run somewhere $1 to $3 million. But as we mentioned, if there was a highly rated agency that was guaranteeing the project, there might be on the lower end of that cost range. So it's not, you can do this in different ways, but in any event, there is also a commitment fee. So the total amount that you are going to borrow at conditional commitment, you pay 0.6% up to the first $2 billion. And then a lot of applicants will hire their own advisory service firm to help them move through the process. Now, in these instances, it's possible that a governmental borrower would have essentially in-house capacity to provide that. We don't know. So we're looking to potential applicants to kind of help think that through. But in any event, those are some of the sources of expenditure in the process. Next slide. So we've provided some reference to the interest rate spread. The core rate is the applicable treasury plus 3/8 and then an additional spread. So the riskier the project, the higher the potential spread. Several things to note here. First of all, there's a blog that's referenced on our website that has a little bit more detail about this. But you can see this. There's a chart that it's published on the LPO website, so you can kind of get a sense. If you can get a sense of where your project would rate, you can kind of get a sense of what your spread might be over the Treasury plus 3/8. We also do have limited funds that are credit subsidy funds. So projects that meet policy objectives that are really strong, they can request a reduction in the essentially the risk-based charge. So that is something that we can consider. Of course, it's optimal to figure out a strategy that reduces the risk of the project essentially and allows you to be on the low cost end of that spectrum. Great, next slide. All right, I think this might be the last one. So we've mentioned that there is a federal support restriction, which means that a project cannot benefit from other federally appropriated funds, in the project's finances. So this can be a little tricky. You have to build a project financial structure that is insulated, for example, from Department of Education funding. You have to really show how it's free and clear from that, just as an example. Tax credits, however, are allowed. So again, that's the major source of opportunity here, is to utilize tax credits. So we work with you carefully on those issues. All projects must comply with Davis-Bacon Act, with NEPA. If you're doing ground-mounted projects, for example, it could be a little bit of a longer timeline there. Projects must provide community benefit plans. The Cargo Preference Act applies, and then for nonprofit and government borrowers, as Elizabeth mentioned, Build America, Buy America provisions do apply. So, we'll work with you on how to manage that. And then lastly, just to reiterate, bigger is better here. It's a lot of effort, it's a lot of work, and you probably don't want to do it for $80 million. Okay. Elizabeth, would you like to expand on any points on this slide?
For those who might not be familiar, just a quick hits. Davis-Bacon says you've got to pay the prevailing wage for the applicable county, for the applicable work classification. If you've ever worked on another federally funded project, you might be familiar, but if not, that's sort of high-level Davis-Bacon. NEPA is the environmental review process. There's different levels of NEPA involvement. If you are just building something on existing facilities, existing buildings and parking lots, that's likely to be a less intensive process. If you're building on completely undisturbed ground that you're clearing in order to build something, that's probably going to be a more involved process. Community benefits plans, probably a pretty slam dunk kind of question for schools, but that's where we're getting at our Justice 40, our disadvantaged communities, understanding if we're making sure we're being inclusive in hiring and staffing these kinds of projects, those kinds of considerations. Cargo preference has to do with how you bring the equipment into the country if it's being imported. So if you're procuring through doing a large procurement, sort of starting understanding where that's coming from, it will be helpful. I guess the other one I would mention on federal support restriction is it's very facts and circumstances driven. Sometimes we see applicants that are taking advantage of generally available federal benefits, like mortgage insurance, that are not sort of awards or grants. And in some circumstances, those might be excluded from sort of the problematic set. So just really encourage you, if you see that and you're concerned, to come to us with the facts, and we can help get you some feedback on that, rather than assuming that you're out of the park because of something without talking to us about it. I do see one question in the chat about the applicant, Hans, that I could try to address, unless you want to wait till. So there's a representative from an ESCO who's asking, you know, who applies? You know, do we apply on behalf of the school or the clients, or do we need them to fill it out directly? And I think the answer to this depends on who is putting up the capital to build a project. In many cases, there are sort of energy developers that do energy as a service, and they really are financing the project. They're doing the financing for the capital expenditures, and they're going to be the direct applicant. If the ESCO is only going to be providing the service of building on behalf of a school, and the school's really the one who has to raise the money and will own the installed assets, in those kinds of situations, it's likely that we will want the school to be more involved in the application process.
There's a question in the chat I will also address about if a project uses a Renew America school grant, does that mean it can't use the LPO financing? I mean, the strict answer is yes. That is an example of a federal grant that would disqualify a project. You know, I think the way to think about it is there one project that has the grant and there's a different project that does not have the grant? Or is the grant for some kind of work that is expended and completed before the LPO finance project would begin? So, you know, there's different ways to think about how to design a project so that it is, you know, kind of free and clear of other federal support.
I see another question about funding programs for smaller projects. I think that's exactly why we see some of the SEFIs coming in and aggregating these smaller projects, right? Because they aren't going to be able to access us directly, but as kind of a portfolio, then they're able to access us. In terms of smaller projects that don't have that, I think a lot of the state green banks are very interested in those kinds of projects and maybe have a smaller ticket size than us. We also have someone on staff who is our financing ecosystem expert. So when we are sort of faced with projects that we can't aggregate and are too small, sometimes she's able to make suggestions or introductions to the ecosystem to help kind of continue that project along its way, even if we're not able to support it at LPO.
All right, next slide. Okay, so we mentioned, you know, the multiple stages of the process. It takes about a year end to end for a project that is, you know, kind of clearly defined and proceeding methodically. It could be faster if there is a guarantee that can reduce the need for complex diligence. It could be longer if there is not, if it is truly a complex project finance. So it really does just depend on the nature of the project and how it's structured. Next slide. Okay, so the last question, slide relates to a good question in the chat about, is there a list of SEFIs? There is not. There is a list on our website of exemplary SEFIs. These are SEFIs that we have indeed, reviewed and said, yep, that looks like a SEFI. The reality is that most states would have several entities that could be a SEFI. And So for us, we look to the applicant or potentially the entity, the SEFI itself, to come to us and say, hey, we're thinking about supporting a project. Can we use SEFI support essentially to allow that project to apply? So we recommend that you think about using our website and the list of SEFIs that are published there, you know, to help navigate what entities in the state might potentially be SEFIs. We can certainly give you some feedback on that. If you come to us and ask us some questions, we can certainly respond to that. But unfortunately, it's not so easy as, you know, here is a list of the entities for you to go talk to. You know, you have to do a little bit of kind of researching, strategizing about what the SEFIs might be. And that could be if you're a public sector entity too. I mean, if you're a school district, it's possible that a school construction entity could be a SEFI. It's possible that the state energy office or the green bank could be a SEFI. And there's different interests that they might have in these projects. So, you know, there's just so many possibilities that we really need for the potential applicants to kind of come up with a strategy and then come to us.
One thing I would add, Hans, is somebody asked, you know, is legislation always required? You can probably tell this from the list of exemplaries, but a number of them didn't pass any new legislation before they were added to the list, right? I think most states actually do have agencies that were set up for the purpose of financing the types of energy projects that we support. That doesn't mean that all potential agencies will meet our definition, but I think it's actually a minority if we were to count that actually were newly created, and often that was not because they were being created to be a SEFI, but because they were already in the process of creating a new green bank or something like that. And so there was legislation associated with that. Let's see. And so I see a number of questions about kind of examples of schools that are doing this and publishing information. So we do publish transaction profiles when we close deals. So if and as we move these through, you will see them. We don't have any up yet. We are having active conversations. We have an applicant in the pipeline or two. So we hope that we'll have something to share with you that will be exemplary, but not yet. So work with us and help us change that.
Just going to add that a SEFI is really a state or you know, public agency or quasi-public agency. It's not a local entity, and we look for the investment of state dollars, not local dollars. Now, it is likely that local dollars will be very important to these projects. They can play other, you know, provide other sources of capital in the capital stack, but that one specific qualifying investment from a SEFI, you know, is generally going to need to be state dollars through a SEFI. So again, we're here to give you feedback on what that might be. Okay, next slide. All right, last comment here. One of the nice things about LPO is that we are not like a grant making agency where we can't help you put in your best application. We will help you put in your best loan request because we need to know all the information about your project, and we're going to work with you on, you know, helping to understand what it is that you want to do, and so that we can understand how to determine ability to repay and all of the many complex issues associated with your project. So as we progress with whether it's a state that is interested, and we do have interest from states about doing these projects in the school sector, or if it's a company that is the applicant, in either event, we would convene regular calls. You know, we talk to you to work through all of the issues that arise over time, whether in the pre-application stage or all the way through commitment. Elizabeth?
That's a great point. It's a very iterative process, and it's very different than what you may have experienced with a lot of other federal funding approaches. I guess I did see one more question that we hadn't answered on M&V, but that's the kind of thing that I would encourage you, I think, to follow up with us so we can dive in and give you a little bit more information specific to what you're considering.
That was excellent, Hans and Elizabeth. I was trying to keep track of the questions in the chat. You guys are doing a great job answering. as we went. I had the M&V, so I'm glad you just answered that. I do have one other one in here that I don't think we answered, asking would the CBO or superintendent of the school district be able to use the loan for a full master plan, energy related and non-energy related, or is this an application per project that meets all requirements?
I think most of the costs are going to have to be energy related. If you have a comprehensive plan and it's all energy related, though, that might be broader than you are thinking of. So maybe if you wanted to provide us a copy of the plan, and then we could give you more specific feedback.
That was great. Any final thoughts? Otherwise, I think you guys did an excellent job explaining. I think I just want to emphasize what Hans been saying throughout, and certainly Elizabeth too. Like, this is complicated, and we're here to work with you, or really LPO, I should say. And I will direct you to them. We really want people to take advantage. You know, we want to have those couple case studies that we can share. We don't have that to date, but would love that. And this has been a great partnership just internally within DOE, trying to think of how can we maximize LPO for different entities than what traditionally have accessed this funding in the past.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, just as a reminder in the chat, I put a couple times, this is being recorded and the slides will be available. We knew this would be a lot to take in. Hopefully you can go back and reference different parts of it as you have questions. It'll be posted through our YouTube channel. So please be on the lookout. We'll send a follow-up email when that is all available on our website. And then just a couple other closing highlights as we wrap up here in the last couple minutes. Other really big announcement for us this morning. For the Renew America Schools program, our next round of applications actually opened this morning. So please visit herox.com/Renew Schools Prize. You can also just visit our Renew America Schools webpage and all of the links will be there. We do have a webinar coming up tomorrow. This will be recorded. And we have a follow-up one next Tuesday and office hours in April and May. Applications will be due June 13th. So no, this is long anticipated and people have been anxiously awaiting, but the applications are officially open. So please sign up for those webinars so you can learn a little bit more. I also mentioned at the top of the hour, we are planning an elective pay webinar in April and May. So stay tuned on our website. We'll post the date as we confirm that here shortly. And then we also had a webinar last week on March 12th, all about 4 different tools and resources. So please check out the recording and the recording, is available. We actually demoed the tools, so there's no slides associated with it. And then you're also welcome to watch our webinar back from November called The Power of Partnerships, and hopefully that's helpful. So a lot of great information all on our website. We try to keep people up to date. Please don't forget to sign up for updates. That's a really great way to receive our email blasts with this information. I'm also gonna plug in Hans and Elizabeth's and a general SEFI email address for anyone that wants to reach out to them directly. In the chat, you're welcome to. You're also always welcome to email us at schools@doe.gov, and we will certainly get you connected with the right people at LPO. With that, I think we were right at an hour. That was perfect. Hopefully answered a lot of questions, got some wheels turning. Lots to think about here.
Looking forward to speaking with you all. Please do not hesitate to reach out.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.